Welcome everyone to the latest episode of the CIH Podcast. My name is Callum Homchuk and I'm your host for this episode. Today we're going to talk about the housing sector and domestic abuse. As listeners will know, 7 years ago CIH launched its domestic abuse campaign Make a Stand, and a challenge to the UK housing sector to do much more to help support victims of domestic abuse. So today we're guests. We want to have a discussion around actually how has the landscape changed, how have attitudes changed, how's practice changed, and critically, how have outcomes changed for victims of domestic abuse across the UK. So to join me in this discussion today, we've got three fantastic guests. We've got Hannah Gaston, who's the Housing and Inclusion Manager at Maidstone Borough Council. We have Paul Short, who's Service Manager at Fife Council. And we have Kelly Henderson, Founder and Managing Director at Addressing Domestic Abuse. So great to have all three with us today. I think, Kelly, probably start with you to get the kind of conversation going. So could you give our listeners a little bit of a sense about a little bit more about the sector's role in addressing domestic abuse and why domestic abuse should be a priority for landlords in the UK housing sector?
Yes, certainly. Thank you for having me today. Well, I think for me, establishing, I've been one of the co-founders of the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance over 10 years ago. At that time, I felt as if domestic abuse wasn't really on the agenda. So I do think that, particularly in England, we've seen a different focus over the years where we've now had the Social Housing Regulation Act came in force, obviously back in 2023. We've seen a change in the consumer standards from April last year.
I'll maybe come to Hannah and ask for her perspective as well. Hannah, but I suppose coming to you about, Kelly's talked there a little bit about some of the changes that's happened in the sector, really positive ones. I suppose, is there any reflections from yourself, Hannah, but maybe what are some of the catalysts behind at least the change in narrative around the domestic abuse in the UK housing sector?
Hi there, thanks for welcoming me on today. I work for a district council in Kent, so it's a two-tier authority, and we're the lower tier, Maidstone. And there's been, from our perspective, there's been significant change over the coming years. I was actually just reviewing our figures. And in 1819, the number of people that were coming through to temporary accommodation for us who were domestic abuse survivors was about 30 to 33 people, households each year. That has shot up to 110, and I think that's a lot to do with the enactment of the domestic abuse bill that happened in the 2020, and also the changes to our staff team and how we work with people who are experiencing domestic abuse and stalking, not just DA, but the stalking part as well. And we've transformed our staff team, our offer, and the support offer that people can receive. Plus, we've responded by setting up our own supported housing projects. So I think for local authorities in England, I think the main driver has been the Domestic Abuse Act, which has worked really well. But the downside of that, it does cost, there's significant financial impact on our temporary accommodation budgets and obviously other council services.
That's really interesting here, Hannah, and I think you're talking around the Domestic Abuse Act, and Kelly obviously talked about the kind of Social Housing Regulation Act as well. So it feels like legislation is really playing a positive role there in driving that response from the sector, which is exactly its purpose. I suppose I'm quite interested in actually some of the challenges you might be facing at your local authority, and how has it felt about trying to actually kind of mobilize a kind of staff response and ensure the right training and the cultural thing, because we can have requirements from government and regulators which are wonderful, but the proof of the pudding's in the eating. So how have you managed to try and drive a cultural response within the local authority to ensure that you've got the right people, the right skills, the right training, and you're dealing in the most sensitive and then victim-centered way?
Well, when the Act was enacted, there was a new burdens that's been, which is a financial budget that's issued to every local authority to help with that enactment of the bill. At that point, we made a decision to create a domestic abuse and safeguarding coordinator. So they would work across our council, ensuring that all teams in our local district understood and are aware of domestic abuse and safeguarding. Alongside that, we also have recently changed the way that we operate. and we have only a face-to-face service really about people that are approaching. And so we did a lot of trauma training with staff. We've got trauma ambassadors. We've got people who will support individuals. We've got domestic abuse support workers. We've got specialist domestic abuse housing advisors. They work specifically with those households that are approaching us. So we've also slightly altered our team to ensure that we've covered those areas, and that people, when they come through, because obviously homelessness is a pretty stressful experience, but obviously if you're homeless because you're fleeing domestic abuse, it's even more stressful. So we were looking for those key skills from staff around people that understood, could empathise, but can also work with households to move them forward, because obviously we don't want people to stay in temporary accommodation forever or be providing supports forever. We want people to be able to return and to living in the community and having being community assets. And so we've worked really hard on our kind of culture, as you rightly pointed out. How have we changed that? We also have a homelessness and rough sleeping strategy, which the whole massive section of that is based around domestic abuse. So we've got lots of experience from colleagues to do that. But also, we wouldn't be able to do it unless our senior colleagues and our members were really on board, and they've always been hugely supportive of us working in that realm and being able to support people who need it most. Not just with domestic abuse, we also work with rough sleepers and other homeless families. But without that corporate buy-in, I don't think we would be where we are today.
Yeah, I think that sounds actually an incredible response actually regarding the services that you're providing and that kind of clear leadership that the local authority is able to demonstrate, and that you're right, is fundamentally going to be essential to the success. Paul, I wonder if I can bring you in at this point and sort of maybe unpacking the challenge around that cultural change in organisation. And so, Paul, I think you know what I'm going to ask you about the kind of Change Justice Fairness report, obviously that Fife commissioned many years ago, looking at the delivery of kind of services across your own local authority. I wonder if you just talk to listeners a little bit about what the findings of that identified around the kind of performance in Fife at that time, and how you've also sought to kind of change your approach and leadership and structure and service delivery.
Yeah. Hi, Callum, and thank you for the invitation to take part. I think, I suppose the landscape in Scotland is maybe slightly different from England. In 2016, we'd undertaken a bit of research along with Scottish Women's Aid to look at our services across Fife. We were picked as an exemplar local authority. And the conversation was really around, well, what is the experience like for women? And it was a real eye-opener for us. And I think, I always say, I think we're quite a good local authority, and I think that if we have challenges around this area, so will other local authorities. So the types of things that women were saying to us was around how difficult it was to access advice, and that people felt they had to approach us on multiple occasions and retell their story. So in a sense, almost re-traumatizing people. And we equally had women saying to us, well, I kind of feel like I'm being forced down the homeless route, and that's maybe where I don't want to go. And I think that is something that we're all guilty of, is thinking about domestic abuse as a homelessness issue, and it's not. It's a housing advice issue. It's a societal issue, and we need to think differently about that. The other thing that they basically said to us was that staff, some were very empathetic, others weren't. There was a real mixed bag, and I think culturally that was an absolute wake-up call for us, and I was tasked pretty early on as the kind of senior champion of trying to pull together some structures to address that. So pretty much like Hannah was describing, we created a post to act at a kind of operational level to lead that. So we created a lead officer's post. And my colleague Sandra's done phenomenal work in that. But it was around pulling people together. And what we basically felt was, in terms of culture, where we wanted to get to is that all our staff were able to recognise the signs of domestic abuse where they saw it, where they found it, were able to have a good conversation with the tenant or applicant around that, and to make sure that staff knew how to act and how to pass things on. And on the back of that, we did a power of training to try and kind of change the culture. We spoke very early on to survivors to get their views on how we should redesign services. And I think for anybody who is thinking about redesigning services, it's really important to speak to people that have that lived experience and to talk through that. And just some really simple things that we hadn't thought about around, if you complete an application online, what if a perpetrator walks in and sees you doing that? So we redesigned our web-based systems to include a kind of hot button, so that you could immediately shut the application down, and it saved it. But I think the kind of biggest change for us was that kind of cultural change, and making sure that we were living up to housing's role in Equally Safe. So within Scotland, we've got a national strategy called Equally Safe, which describes how all partners are going to work together to keep women and girls safe from violence. And this was our kind of contribution towards that, and thinking about that. But it's been a real journey. But I think the housing sector has a really important role to play in this, because if you think about it, I'm just using my own authority as an example. We have 300 plus staff who are out in communities every day, from safer community officers who go out at night, to antisocial behaviour calls, to housing management officers who are out in tenancies every day. They are the eyes and ears basically of an organisation. They will come across things. So the basic thing that you want to do is make sure that all of those staff know what to look for, know how to engage in a conversation, and have a very clear route and a very clear pathway to pass things. And it is about moving us on a prevention footing rather than treating this as a homelessness issue.
Thanks very much. I mean, there is so much to talk about. I mean, that challenge around cultural change, and Hannah talked about it as well. You're one part of someone's life. That's
exactly.
It's such a deeper societal issue. Can I just ask you very quick? I mean, we bring Hannah then back to Kelly, but just a little bit on maybe. I think you talked there really thoughtfully around the kind of response that you're delivering in Fife. I suppose I'm quite interested in what I said in my introduction around outcomes. Now, how are you finding are you seeing a change in the actual outcomes experienced by victims?
Yeah, we are. So there's a couple of key things that we looked at. We wanted less women to feel that they had to go down the homelessness route. So we've had a real kind of sea change in that. The numbers of people experiencing domestic abuse that go down the homelessness route has reduced significantly. And the amount of people going through our normal kind of housing advice route and approaching us before they reach crisis has increased, remarkably over that time. And that was one of our key indicators. And I think it's that bit about flipping it away from, I've reached a crisis point. I have to come in and see somebody now because I have to leave the home. And I think the other thing is around that we assume in the housing world that when we give the survivor a property, that's the job done and that's the end of it. And when we're talking to women, that is so naive, because actually that's the hardest part, because you've got to possibly re-establish yourself in a new house. You might need all new furniture. You might have had to have left that home that you were in and leave the things that are really valuable to you. So one of the really simple things we've done is create a little pot of flexible money to support survivors with whatever they feel they need to help their journey into that. And it's dead simple things. It's like storing their goods, the things that they really love, for a short period of time until they get their property. And in terms of addressing trauma, kids taking their toys with them to that new address, the toys that they've loved, the clothes that they've loved, the things from their own room, that makes a massive, massive difference. And I think we have to remember that when people experiencing domestic abuse approach us, they are at the lowest point in their life. So it's up to us as a landlord, as a statutory housing authority, to respond to that appropriately. It's our duty, actually. It's an ethical duty for me as well, actually.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, it was really helpful to hear about the positive interventions and the outcomes. Hannah, I see you wanted to come in. Are you still, this is some relevance to what Paul had picked up, and then Kelly, I keen to come back to you in just a moment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say around the keeping the issue alive in the organisation, and really picking up on what Paul said around staff training and awareness. We actually are having a DA day in 2 weeks where the whole of the housing team are going to be learning about domestic abuse, around prevention, around what options are available in Kent, and how we as individuals, because as Paul said, we will be maybe at times the first people that those people ever talk to about this issue, and it's about how we deal with that well and to achieve those outcomes. Or even if people aren't over in their communication around experiencing domestic abuse, but we can pick up on it, that we're professionally curious enough to make sure that no one slips through the net. And that's our job. I mean, we are concentrating on housing, but we also have across our organisation, we have domestic abuse and safeguarding champions in every single team. And then we meet centrally to talk about those kind of things, to make sure all that info is disseminated out.
I mean, that sounds, Hannah, that sounds wonderful. And Kelly, I sort of bring you in again at this point. I'd imagine the examples of what Hannah and Paul are talking around are unfortunately exceptional, and that they are by exception. We're probably not seeing that. Means that across all social landlords to the scale we'd like to see. I suppose just any reflection maybe from yourself around the kind of the work that is going on in these local authorities, and also critically, what is it we want to see in domestic abuse policies? Maybe taking some of the examples we heard there, but is there more we'd like to see in an effective domestic abuse policy across any social landlord?
Yeah, I think that what I found, particularly I've been working with a group of housing providers on the Scottish borders, and I think they all decided to come together to work together on their response. So, sometimes people are really large organisations with lots of resources, but equally you might get some smaller organisations with less resources. So I think it's I think I've seen that the leadership in each organisation, going back to what Hannah and Paul have both alluded to, making sure that it's on the agenda, having those domestic abuse days, I think it's really important. So I'm currently doing a piece of work with the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, and again, it's kind of link this back to, well, what does this mean for housing? So what does this mean? When I was a housing officer, what are some of the things that I could be looking for, and making it really understandable and relating it to your actual job? So, if you're an income management, rent arrears person, kind of what are the things that you should be looking for so that you can understand domestic abuse, understanding, the role that you can have in your day-to-day work. So it's not kind of seen as something, well, that's nothing to do with me. So I'm producing a reflective toolkit for the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. And again, that's to make it really practical, so people can feel that they've got real practical things that they can do to make a real difference in somebody's life.
Kelly, I mean, I think your point there around the buy-in from, and I think you obviously, Paul and Hannah have touched upon this as well. Actually, that need for buy-in seems critical, doesn't it? Actually, we can have corporate leadership, we can have government leadership, but the reality is that victims will be engaging with frontline practitioners, and actually we need that buy-in. But from what you're saying regarding the development of the toolkit, and I think maybe even from reflecting on what Paul and Hannah have talked about their experience, it seems like we can move in that direction. That it's possible to get that buy-in from staff and develop that cultural change.
Yeah, definitely. We're at a good point now, have those champions that the others have talked about. And I think for me, it was working with the Scottish borders, working with Berwickshire Housing as an example, with Michelle Meldrum, who's the chief executive, saying, right, let's get together with some other providers, and having that leadership to say, this is led at the top level of the organisation. It's not somebody who's a housing officer who thinks, well, actually, I want to make a difference. That is very, very important. Know what you can do in your role. But I think that leadership at the top level of the organisation really states the intention, doesn't it? And it makes that difference. And I think what we put on our website, what we put in our tenants' newsletters, every interaction, making sure that it's top of the agenda.
Kelly, I absolutely agree, and I think that Kelly, if I was to give you a challenge, so I think if someone was to say to me, and I think a lot of we have these policies, we can focus on training, and that's all nice, and that's all good and important. But what does that policy look like? And I think Paul talked a little bit about a kind of leaving fund. I thought it was a really clear example of of some of the policies that landlords should be considering as part of domestic abuse policy. What is it when you're working with landlords and you're looking across the sector? What are you saying? These are the things that will make the difference. These are the things that victim survivors want and need in order to try and rebuild their lives. Are there any specific, if there were a few priorities, so you can say to any listeners, these are the things beyond the listening to survivors, let's hopefully take that as read, but beyond the listening to survivors, are there some examples of really good practice, like these are the things you should be considering? Is there anything you could advise listeners on?
Yeah, I feel like kind of breaking down the barriers to, accessing the things that a survivor might need post domestic abuse. So, helping in some cases to move on.
Thank you, Kelly. Hannah, so you wanted to come in on that point as well.
Yeah, I just also think there's all those organisational kind of responses in terms of funding and supporting people moving on, or and sustaining their new life, so to speak, are great. But I think also the issue that which is challenging for housing providers and local authorities is that the perpetrator often stays within the family home, and the victim and the children move out, and it's a huge upheaval. And I was wondering if there was something that we need to do about how we challenge that with housing providers, because a lot of people fleeing domestic abuse are probably coming from registered provider landlords, and it's around how we work as a collective to manage that. And because it just always feels desperately unfair that the victim is also victimized again, because they have to move into temporary accommodation. They have to uproot their whole life. And I'm not sure as a sector that we've really got on top of how we challenge that at all, really.
Hannah, I think that is such an excellent point. I think it speaks to, and I'll bring Paul back in, because you're talking about the experience of victims having to tell their stories to time and time again, and them being disadvantaged by the system that's supposed to help them. I know in Scotland, I'm just using my chair's privilege here, in Scotland we passed legislation 4 years ago that was supposed to, when enacted, which I believe is now going to be later this year, will give powers to social landlords to end joint tenancies for domestic abuse, so allow perpetrators to be evicted and the tenancy to remain in the hands of the victim survivor. But that's been a long fight to get to that point. The legislation still hasn't been enacted, but there may be some learning from Scotland that might inform England in that way, which is obviously the whole point of CIH, is trying to kind of share that practice. Paul, I'll bring you in as you want to contribute at this point as well.
Yeah, Hannah makes a really good point, and that was one of the things that women have said to us all the way through is, I actually want the option to remain in the home because my connection is here, my family support is here. And I think one of the things that we had to challenge quite early on was staff in a well-intentioned way saying, well, actually, you can't remain there because it's not safe. And if I was to give any advice to any organisation writing their policy, it would be around enshrining within that you are following the wishes of the individual. You're following the wishes of the person with the experience. But I think, just to come back to Hannah's really good point about remaining in the home, we have tested that on occasion where we've managed to persuade perpetrators to leave the property. We've offered them an alternative property to go to, and we've left the family in the property. And I think the key to that is making the woman and their family feel safe in that property. So I think one of the things you want to have a little look at in any policy is, what safety measures are you going to put in to support a woman to remain in the family home where the perpetrator moves out. And we have a brilliant scheme called 5 Cares, which we go in and we give safety advice, and we fit additional locks and additional alarms, etc. And Callum, just to come back on your point about the Domestic Abuse Protection Act, because you know how frustrated I've been around that as well. The same as yourself, there was guidance just come out last week for us to comment on in terms of the enactment of the Act. So it looks like it is really, really moving, which is really welcome. And I think there'll be lots and lots of great learning from that for landlords. And I think the kind of crux of it will be making the whole kind of process of taking it to court as simple as it can be, and as straightforward for landlords and for people. But I think there's that bit about if the survivor is remaining in the family home, how do you make them feel safe there? And it comes back to this whole kind of thread that I spoke about earlier around, actually helping someone sustain their home and make a success of it. So there's a little bit of learning in there for us, I think, as well.
Thanks, Paul. And I think it's I think one of the words you just used there about moving perpetrators out was persuading. And I think it's just the point. We're still in that point right now without that legal framework, isn't it? That it's persuasion that's required in order to deliver the outcome that we know is best, the best for victims. Hannah, so bring you in at this point.
Yeah, I just wanted to, we actually undertook a really very small pilot where we would offer alternate accommodation to perpetrators. So the victims could remain in the home. Often it was, in our experience in that pilot, the men were the perpetrators, and we were trying to offer them accommodation so they didn't keep returning to the family home, because that we found was a big issue of why the abuse continued, was because they had nowhere else to go. And at that time, those individuals would not have met the priority need threshold, which is what we have in England, to be accommodated, to go into temporary accommodation. So we kind of overlooked that on this pilot, and it did work really well. And then our TA numbers went through the roof, and so we had to end our pilot because we couldn't afford it. And that's what, all of these initiatives and ways of working are excellent, but they all take a significant financial investment. And I'm just, with the homeless prevention grant that we get in England, and the new burdens, it's generous, and it's gone up this year, which is great, but it's still not really scratching the surface of what we could do in terms of innovation. And councils have got to manage their base budgets, and so things like supporting perpetrators of domestic abuse into accommodation isn't very sexy for a council and won't be a priority for them. So it's about how we kind of manage and juggle those competing priorities and demands.
That absolutely easier said than done, Hannah. But a really good point to make. Kelly, I wonder if I could bring you back in, so building on a little bit of point that Hannah said around the challenges. But I'm really interested in what you said at the start of the episode around the Social Housing Regulation Act, and Hannah touched upon legislation as well. And I was wondering, what are some of the kind of the really good practice we've saw regarding the introduction of a domestic abuse policy requirement? How has that, would you say, has changed practice on the ground? Are we seeing high quality policies across England? I'm keen from a parochial Scottish perspective, because we're introducing legislation currently that will give that requirement on social landlords in Scotland. So I'm just wondering a bit of reflection on how has that requirement landed in England, and has it driven the outcomes you'd hope to have seen?
Yeah, I've obviously worked with quite a few organisations who've just introduced their policy. But for me, it's all about not the policy, but what good is that policy if it just sits on a shelf and you don't kind of translate that to your day-to-day practice? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So I think that the policy is one thing, but I was just having this conversation yesterday. And for me, I feel like it's great that we've now got regulation under the consumer standards around domestic abuse. But I feel like kind of having a policy, as I say, is one thing, but what's the point of a policy if you don't have the training? And Hannah talked about, that understanding domestic abuse and being, understanding trauma. So if your policy says do this, this, and this, but you don't know you don't understand domestic abuse and you don't understand trauma, then I think the practical application of that policy isn't going to be translated as well as it could be. So I feel the regulator, for me, needed to go further and say, have a policy, but ensuring that all frontline, anybody who was going into somebody's home needed to have a certain level of training. And I think this really feeds back into the discussion that we're having at the moment about professionalism in housing, and
absolutely
that feeds into that debate as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, Kelly, you're in my brain. Honestly, I could not agree with you
Great
more.
minds think alike.
It really is. I think that's exactly the discussion we're having in Scotland. We have this policy requirement that is going to be introduced in legislation, which we really welcome, like absolutely welcome. We recognise the voluntary approach hasn't driven it, but I think there's a really interesting learning to take place from England. We're setting ourselves up to fail unless we try to address the capacity and the knowledge gaps. The things that we've talked about in this episode, Paul's talked about his Change Justice Research Report and Fife. We know there's capacity and learning gaps. We can't just create a policy and expect the sector to respond overnight. If it was going to do so, it would have done so without regulation. So we need to invest in that training and that capacity building. But the point you really eloquently put there is it's broader than just it's that ongoing commitment around professionalisation. How do we ensure we're embedding training and learning and from each other about how we improve our policies over time and improve our practice over time? And I think it's a key point. I hope in Scotland we can learn from maybe where it's fell a little bit short in England so far. Paul, could it bring you in at this point?
I think that's a really great point that Kelly makes, that it is about making sure that we embed it and staff understand what they're doing. And I think there is a wider kind of topic in the housing. If you think about a normal frontline housing officer, they're going out into houses and they're going to see all sorts of things. And I think it's how we join that together in a coherent kind of safeguarding way to make sure that when staff are out, they're trained to think about domestic abuse, they're trained to think about child protection, and they're trained to think about adult support and protection. And that kind of intersection around all that different safeguarding legislation sometimes is a bit tricky for staff to work their way through. So I think culturally, and one of the things that we're looking a lot more at is how do you join that all up so that a housing officer isn't thinking in a little silo. They're thinking about their whole kind of safeguarding duty when they're out. And quite often domestic abuse intersects with child protection and with adult support and protection as well. And there's just been some really, really interesting research here in Scotland called Unseen and Unheard, which is about women who have learning disabilities and how it's much, much more prevalent domestic abuse around people with learning disabilities. So I think it's how we try to join all that safeguarding together and make sure that it makes sense for staff, so that when your staff member is going into a house, if they're seeing things, again, it's back to that, recognising it, knowing what to do about it and engage empathetically in that conversation and knowing how to act and to pass it on. But to make a wee plea for frontline housing officers, I think it is about trying to join the whole safeguarding function up a bit more for them so that they understand it and know how it all acts together.
Paul, I think it's a really, really good point there. I mean, when we are going to run out of time to explore the kind of range of things around the kind of intersectionality and the kind of the risks that are relevant and how we identify and support. And so I'm pretty keen to move on to probably we've got 5 minutes or so left just to try and move the top discussion on a little bit. Paul, I already asked you about the outcomes that are being delivered, and you did say that actually you are seeing better outcomes. I suppose to Kelly and to Hannah as well, I'm interested in what you say. Would you see, we've talked a bit about process, we've talked a bit about practice, but I'm interested in your perspective. Are you seeing improved outcomes for victims of domestic abuse? Kelly, I'll come to you first and then we'll go to Hannah. Are we seeing better outcomes in England for victims?
I feel like there's much more awareness, but I feel we're still just scratching.
It's not a yes, is it? Unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's scratching the surface really, and I think in terms of consumer standards, they only came into operation in April 2024 in England. So I think it'll be good to have a look back and say 2 years after the consumer standards to see if we had an increase in numbers, disclosing domestic abuse and seeing it as part of our day-to-day work. So I think it will be interesting to have a look at that. I'm a board member at Believe Housing, so I feel that there's a real role there for board members to understand requirements around, what organisations are required to do around domestic abuse as well. So I think there's that board learning piece, but also let's have a look back in a couple of years' time to see how far we've come and where the gaps still are as well, and make sure that we're constantly learning all the time and hearing from victim survivors themselves.
Yeah, absolutely, Kelly. And Hannah, so I suppose same question to you then. How confident do you feel about the kind of changing outcomes? Are you seeing it at maybe a more local level? Are you confident that things are improving?
Yes, definitely. And I think that's it. We see it on a local level for our customers in Maidstone and those applicants that approach us for accommodation. We're getting really good outcomes, and also we're supporting the children. So it's not just an individual outcome, it's a household family outcome, and bringing stability to people's lives. And also because we the way that we work are those households and families are having interaction with the wider team. So it's also skilling up the team. So it's a kind of win-win for us nationally. I mean, I still think it's postcode lottery. Wherever you approach in housing, you won't get the same offer. It won't be uniform, and even at times there will be gatekeeping. It does still happen, and it's sad to think that, but that is true.
Yeah, it's really interesting getting that perspective. I very much agree with the positivity we're seeing around. I think the narrative, the awareness and discussion is definitely in a positive place. I think you've all talked about that in a really clear way, but performance is patchy. Policies are patchy, so outcomes are going to be patchy. Now that building that narrative, that knowledge, that understanding is obviously essential to improve those outcomes, but I think from our discussion today, we recognise we've still got a long way to go. We haven't even talked. So we're talking today about essentially social housing. This is a minority sector, isn't it? We're not really exploring private housing, which is whether it's the private renting sector or owner occupation, which is fraught with challenges. But I think as housing professionals, we need to understand how we can best support victims wherever they're living. Domestic abuse isn't tenure blind, so our response has to reflect all tenures. I'm not going to ask you for your opinion on that because I do not think we've got enough time to get into that today. I am just going to conclude and just to say thank you very much to our guests, to Kelly Henderson, to Hannah Gaston, to Paul Short for your kind of contribution and discussion today. Just to let all the listeners know that CIH has a new domestic abuse community and practice group just launched earlier this year. So you are in the sector, and if you're listening to this, you clearly are, and you want to know more about it, please get in touch with the CIH policy team. We'll kind of direct you to when the next meeting takes place. I think sometime in April is the next one. So again, just thanks to all our guests for listening, for taking part, but to you all for listening, and do tune into our next podcast either on the website and YouTube. Thank you very much for your time.